thanks so much for joining us today to a very timely conversation being hosted by the Transition Accelerator and the Ivey Foundation. My name is Bruce Laurie. I'm president of the Ivey Foundation. And as many of you may know, we're very much focused on supporting Canada's transition to a net zero economy, while also focusing on long-term competitiveness for the country. So today's discussion is part of the Accelerator's Pathways to Net Zero webinar series. Paisley just presented some of the examples of upcoming courses. And it's just great that we've got such interest across the country in learning more about net zero. And I'm particularly excited about this panel because in a remarkably short period of time, we've managed to get the top minds in the country to explain what is sometimes a complicated issue, but I think we're going to learn a ton today from Andrew, Martin, and Nathalie. Before I introduce our panel, I want to acknowledge that the Transition Accelerator has staff across many provinces of this country. We acknowledge the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live, and we recognize and respect the ongoing relationships that Indigenous peoples have to the land, and we commit to the ongoing process of reconciliation. Now, on to the subject of our workshop today. Just a little backdrop. Not many people would probably know that I actually got my start in environmental work by participating in one of the largest environmental impact assessments in Canadian history, and that was the Environmental Impact Assessment of Ontario's Demand Supply Plan in the early 1990s. So I have some direct experience in that, and actually was quite involved in impact assessment in the early 1990s through my consulting work. So I'm particularly interested in this case and the Supreme Court of Canada's recent ruling on the Impact Assessment Act. So today we have we're really honored to have a distinguished panel of experts who will help us navigate the complexities of this ruling and dig into its broader implications. Their insights will undoubtedly contribute to more nuanced understanding of what lies ahead for environmental policy and the regulatory landscape, and obviously for things that are quite top of mind. If anyone saw the Jerry's report, the Environmental Commissioner today, on the challenges that we're going to have in meeting our net zero targets. So this is a critical decision that affects how we will build infrastructure, how we will build out our electricity system, and I think anyway, I'm excited to hear what our experts have to say. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Nathalie Chalifour. Nathalie is a lawyer at the University of Ottawa with extensive expertise in environmental policy and impact assessment, and she will be moderating the session today. So Nathalie, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bruce, and thank you to the Transition Accelerator for organizing this webinar and inviting me to moderate. I'd like to also recognize that I'm speaking to you from unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. So before we begin the conversation with our two experts who are going to be answering some questions posed by me and then also posed by you in the audience, if you wish, I was asked to provide a brief overview of the decision just to set the stage. I'm sure there's many of you on the webinar who are familiar with it, but some of you who may not be. So I'm going to use a few slides. I'll just share my screen here. And in 10 minutes or less, I'm going to explain to you essentially the Supreme Court's decision in this case. So everybody can see my screen, yes? Okay. So most of you probably know there's a long history of environmental assessment in this country. So there's a lot of detail here that I'm not going to go into, but suffice it to say that there have been essentially four federal assessment frameworks, legal frameworks in Canada over the last several decades. So in the first two frameworks, assessments were essentially triggered by the exercises of federal decision-making responsibility, like issuing a federal permit under the Fisheries Act or some such thing. And as you may know, the first iteration of this kind of environmental assessment, the guidelines order, was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada as constitutional in a decision you may have heard about, the Old Man River decision. Now in 2012, Bill C-69 was introduced and brought in some pretty significant changes to environmental assessment federally, including the move away from these federal decision-making triggers to a designated project list. And with that change, as many of you know, the number of assessments done annually went from several thousand a year to under 100, basically focusing on major projects. And then when the Impact Assessment Act was passed in 2019, after, I'm sure many of you know, a very lengthy parliamentary process, it did maintain the designated project list approach, but introduced also a number of other changes, including a planning phase, integration of a broader list of factors, and a decision linked to a public interest determination, which we're going to come to in a moment. So shortly after the law was enforced, the province of Alberta asked its Court of Appeal, the Alberta Court of Appeal, whether this law was constitutional. So that's what's called a reference decision, a reference case. It's a question asking an opinion on constitutionality. The court held it to be unconstitutional. That decision was appealed at the Supreme Court of Canada, which rendered the decision we're discussing today on October 13th. So the court sat with a bench of 7 judges, and the decision was split 5-2, with the majority holding that the main part of the Impact Assessment Act, the designated project list component, went beyond Parliament's jurisdiction. So it was this main part of the act that it said basically veered a little bit out of Parliament's lane in a couple of areas that I'm going to explain in a moment. There was also a minority or a dissent, differing opinion. We won't have time to talk about that today, maybe in the Q&A, but not in this presentation. It also held, though, that there's a very distinct part of the law which governs projects carried out or financed by federal authorities or on federal land or outside Canada, and that's constitutional. So that was carved out as being held to be constitutional. Now, you've probably heard it's a reference and it's an advisory opinion. That is true. So that means that no part of the act was formally struck down by this decision, but it is convention that Parliament is going to take steps to amend the legislation to bring it into conformity with the Supreme Court's decision. So what was decided? First off, it's worth noting that the court reiterated some things we already knew, which is that environmental protection is important and that both levels of government have jurisdiction over environment and including environmental assessment. So that's not new, but the court underlined and confirmed this. Indeed, it said shared federal and provincial responsibility for impact assessment is the norm, and it's neither unusual nor unworkable. The devil, of course, is in the details and in the design of the process. So let's get into what they held to be constitutional and what wasn't. So the court identified 4 key decision-making points in the law, and then it decided which ones of those were okay and which veered out of Parliament's lane. So the first decision point in the law is basically the designation of physical activities on the list. And the court held that constitutionally there is broad scope. This gets a check mark. There's broad scope to include projects on the list that might have impacts on areas within federal jurisdiction. So that doesn't mean the federal impacts have to be shown at that point. That would be putting the cart before the horse, the court said. So it's fine to include projects on that list that are primarily regulated by the provinces as long as there might be federal impacts. So that's important because it clarified that there isn't a sort of enclave of exclusivity provincially. There is a role to play federally at that stage. Next decision point is the screening decision. So once a project is on the list, that doesn't mean an assessment will actually take place. There still has to be a decision screening whether to conduct the assessment or not. And here the court said Parliament went a little too far because it included a list of factors in that decision that has to be taken into consideration, which included some open-ended factors like comments received from the public, regardless of what the comments are about. So the court said it's fine to cast a broad net with the designated list, but then the law has to funnel those decisions to those that are rooted in the possibility of adverse federal effects. So this got not the check mark, it got the X. It was considered to be an unconstitutional portion of the Act. So the next decision point is actually conducting the assessment. And so here again, the court said this is fine. The impact assessment agency can consider quite a broad list of factors here. And the factors, some of you who know the law will know they're enumerated in section 22 of the Act. And it provides quite a long list of factors that are quite comprehensive. But the court said Parliament has wide latitude to gather information to understand a project's effects, even if the project is one that falls, again, primarily regulated under federal or under provincial jurisdiction. And that's consistent with what we heard the Supreme Court say in Old Man River, because the function of assessments, of course, is understanding the environmental effects of projects. And so it's natural to cast a broad net here and really try to understand all of the different implications. So that gets a check mark. Final point of decision-making in the Act that didn't get a check mark but was considered unconstitutional is what we call the public interest determination. You might recall this is where the minister or the governor in council determines whether the project is in the public interest, taking into account a list of 5 factors that are listed in the Act. So the court here was concerned that not all of those factors are sufficiently confined to federal jurisdiction. Some of you may know that the Act requires considering the extent to which a project contributes to sustainability, for instance, and the fact that some of those factors are framed in relation to the assessment of the project as a whole, rather than just the adverse effects within federal jurisdiction, the way the provision is worded. The court said that was unacceptable. It shifted the dominant thrust of the decision away from the acceptability of adverse federal effects and directs it instead to the wisdom of proceeding with the project as a whole. So that, it said, was unconstitutional. And there's some really interesting perspectives offered by the minority opinion on all of these points. But as I said, I won't have time to discuss those in the presentation. Finally, 2 points that'll tee us off for our discussion that we're going to have with Andrew and Martin shortly is 2 broader comments that the court made about the definition of effects within federal jurisdiction, which permeates the language of the Act. So the court expressed concern about the broad wording and the definition of effects within federal jurisdiction, given that there's prohibitions on projects that receive, for instance, a negative public interest determination, such as any change to the environment in another province. So the court said they were concerned about the breadth of that, and that this broad language might dilute the decision maker's focus on federal aspects. And specifically, I think what has been on the minds of many people, perhaps those interested on this webinar, is the implications for interprovincial effects, and particularly greenhouse gases and climate change. On interprovincial effects, the court said that Parliament has clear jurisdiction, as we know from the jurisprudence, on topics like marine pollution, interprovincial river pollution, and minimum standards of carbon pricing, given their interprovincial impacts. Those are all things that the Supreme Court has clearly pronounced on. But that wasn't enough, said the court, to assert jurisdiction over an individual project's greenhouse gases, and that to justify that as a matter within federal jurisdiction, Canada would have had to make out a case for such under the national concern test that was, some of you know, recently updated by the Supreme Court in the carbon pricing reference. So Canada didn't lead any evidence to this effect in the case. So the court said, you haven't established that. That's not to say they couldn't do so, but it hadn't done it here. And so that leaves us, I think, with a lot of questions about implications for greenhouse gases under impact assessment that I know we'll get to in the conversation. So to end the decision, the court ended on a note of urging cooperation. It concluded with its parting words saying that it is, of course, open to Parliament and to the provinces to cooperate. It referenced cooperative federalism, which is the theme of many of the decisions in division of powers in the Supreme Court, and urged both provinces and Parliament to exercise leadership on environmental protection. So perhaps that's a good segue to move into the discussion, since I think the complexities will be in how the decision affects the legislation itself and, of course, other policies. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and now introduce our panelists. So we have, as you know, Bruce mentioned this, but really two people who are experts in Canada on this. Martin Olszynski, and both of them I know are known to most of you, but Martin Olszynski is an associate professor with the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. He's one of Canada's leading experts in environmental and natural resources law, including division of powers and environmental assessment. He worked many years in the public service as well with the Department of Justice, so he knows the practical side of these issues very well. And you just have to read one of his blogs on the A-blog website to appreciate the breadth of his knowledge and his incredible ability to communicate clearly. So I'm really looking forward to his answers to the questions that I'm going to get to pose and that you will pose shortly. And of course, Andrew Leach, again known to many of you, is a professor with the Department of Economics and the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. He's one of Canada's leading energy and environmental economists and has combined this expertise with legal expertise, including division of powers and the regulatory framework governing greenhouse gases and climate policy. He's currently on tour, or perhaps just finished a tour, delivering lectures about his excellent book, which I highly recommend, called Between Doom and Denial. So both are highly accomplished. Both have been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. Both are active on social media platforms and are incredible resources to us, both on those platforms and here on this webinar. So it's truly a privilege to have them with us. And the way this is going to work is I am going to take my prerogative as moderator to pose some questions to Andrew and Martin. And then after a set of questions, we are going to turn it to the audience and have them answer some of your questions, which I believe you can put into the chat. And we are planning to wrap up in about an hour, just under an hour. So I will keep an eye on the clock as well. So starting then with my first question, I'd like to start at a pretty high level and ask each of you, perhaps starting with Martin and then over to Andrew, how much of a shakeup does the Supreme Court's decision here represent? Does it reshape our understanding of the constitutionality of environmental legislation in this country generally, or are things more or less the same, subject to perhaps a slap on the wrist to Parliament for veering a bit out of its lane with the impact assessment? So I'll turn it over to Andrew first, or sorry, to Martin first.
Okay, well, thank you first, Nathalie, for that really generous introduction. And I wanted to also just take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining everyone from the traditional territory of the Peoples of Treaty 7, and that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And so I think my answer to that is to keep going with this water analogy, I guess. I want everyone to envision a river. And we are all the state is in a boat like the voyageurs of old, and I think the question is, what do we have coming forward? Behind us, we knew that there was, in this road of sort of like constitutional battles between the provinces and the federal government, there's been times when the waters were calmer and times when the waters were more rough. We can think about rapids like Class 2, Class 3 rapids, and I think going forward, the question that we all had was, will the Supreme Court maybe, in light of the very serious threat, this existential challenge of climate change, might the Supreme Court smooth out those waters a little bit to enable effective climate action from whichever level of government, frankly, is prepared to take it? And I think the answer has been, no, you're going to stay the course, and that there will still be, while it's certainly possible and navigable, and we will be able to address this challenge, there are rapids still ahead, and that you have to be mindful of those, and you will have to maneuver around some of them, and your path won't be as simple as you might have hoped it would be. So I think that's the way I would put it. And the reason I say it that way, I guess, is for a few reasons. One, I think, as Nathalie has pointed out, in terms of like the real like sort of broader environmental law sort of framework in Canada, the Supreme Court hasn't retreated from that general framework, and in fact, I think has reaffirmed it. And I think here it's important to point out that Alberta, and some of the interveners we're making some very, very strong arguments, that's almost to the point where, to Nathalie's slide, that somehow the federal government should be prohibited from engaging in assessing projects that are regulated primarily at the provincial level. So again, this idea of an enclave or a shield, or what we refer to in the doctrine as interjurisdictional immunity. And so I think the fact that the court made it very clear that that's not the case, that both levels of government, sort of really reiterating this doctrine that we have in constitutional law called the double aspect doctrine, really affirming that in any given fact situation, any given policy challenge, that when we look at the division of powers, that these are really lenses or perspectives upon which to look at these problems, and that both levels of government may legislate in that space through their respective lenses, right? And so the example that's given over and over, the idea, right, that mining, for instance, of course, mining falls within provincial jurisdiction under Section 92A, but to the extent that mines, for instance, have effluent and tailings, and that these can have impacts on fish and fish habitat, as an example, then that aspect is federal, and that, of course, then the federal government can engage and can assess those effects and decide whether or not they are in the public interest. And so I think that that's really powerful and really useful. I think the other thing to recognize in terms of understanding this landscape is that, before the GGPPA, we didn't actually know, what ability Canada did have actually over to regulate GHGs, right? And in fact, somewhat ironically, I think in the leading piece, we had a law review article in the McGill Law Review or Law Journal. It seemed to suggest that Parliament really was prohibited in a sense from really regulating GHGs in a broad manner, except for in the impact assessment context. And of course, what we see now is that a bit of a flip of that, but not entirely. And I think I'll wrap it up on this point and then hand it over to Andrew. I think it's just really important to point out that, again, going into the GGPPA reference, the carbon price reference, we knew nothing in terms of actual authority from the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said there was, okay, yes, you have these minimum national standards for carbon pricing. And so then what happened here, as Nathalie pointed out, is it's not that they said you don't have it, it's you didn't make the case. And you can't do an end run around what we just spent all 3-4 years with 3 Court of Appeal decisions and a Supreme Court decision talking about minimum standards of carbon pricing. If you have this broad unfettered jurisdiction over GHGs, why would we have gone through all of that, right? So then here, it's not even that you don't have it, it's you didn't make the case. Now, of course, that's maybe putting a bit of a gloss on it in the sense that it's not, these cases aren't fun to make, and going back to the Supreme Court and having to get these things sort of settled, that has its own drag and its own sort of creates its own static, if you will. But I think that that's a really an important point, that the situation isn't you can't do this, it's you didn't make the case.
So I'm laughing there because I think Martin and I have had this argument a million times, where my response has often been, if we knew that the federal government had this jurisdiction, the GGPPA reference would have been 3 paragraphs long and it would have been decided from the bench. And of course, we don't know where the bounds of federal jurisdiction lies. And this is, in some sense, the second reference where AG Canada, but also some of the interveners, argued around that question, didn't really come at it straight on. It was carbon pricing. It was, in this case, well, we're going to assume effects-based jurisdiction. So we've had a couple of cases where we haven't had that argument. I wonder if we will see one coming up where we do. But before in addition to that, I just wanted to think about this decision in the framework of, is there new law here? And my initial reaction is no, there's not a lot of new law here. But then thinking about that doesn't mean it's not impactful. And when I go back to think about, if we look at the constitutional law curriculum or whatever, a lot of the cases that we study are cases where there wasn't a lot of new law, or where there was an unwillingness on behalf of the courts to allow new jurisdiction. So go back to the Board of Commerce cases in the 20s and 30s, go back to the labor conventions cases, go back to supply management and inflation, all the way through to securities. These are often cases where the federal government's trying to extend into a particular area a little bit too far, and the new law doesn't come from the court saying, yes, this is constitutional. It comes in a sense from the court saying, that's a little bit too far, but have you considered this? And so I think we do see that in this decision. We see the court saying, where things are okay and where things are maybe a little bit too far. And in some cases where a subtle change in wording, so thinking here of securities as the analog, where a subtle change in wording from is this project in the public interest to are the impacts of this project justified under the circumstances might actually be enough to get a large part of the spirit of this legislation sort of over the finish line and to remain in context. So, what do we learn from this? I think number one, we learned that in the same way as in BC, in the Environmental Management Act, that the federal government can't presume to have a veto over all projects that fall under Section 92. And that's what the front end of this act, for my purposes, effectively did. It said, by default, you need federal approval before you start work. And the court says, no, it can't be that. But as Nathalie said in her introduction, there's a line here where if I have a reasonable expectation of effects for which there are federal triggers or federal reasonable expectation of federal decision-making, great, go ahead. The second part, which I think is really interesting in this, right? A lot of the heat and light about this act when it initially came before Parliament and the Senate was about the factors considered in the assessment. And everybody was really upset about some of these broad terms. And the court here effectively says, as the court did in Old Man, that the federal government can consider whatever it wants in making its decision. And provincialists might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. But I'd ask them to step back and say, when, let's say there's a Fisheries Act consideration for a new mine, do you want the federal government to sit back and say, in a vacuum, should we kill fish? Or should we kill fish given all of the jobs, royalties, revenues, energy security, et cetera, that go with this mining project? And if you want the second part, you're actually asking for the federal government to consider things that are clearly within provincial jurisdiction in making their decision. The problem with that is you might not like all the other things that the federal government might consider when making that, but the federal government still, or the court still says that's okay. The last piece, though, and I agree with Nathalie's flag of paragraph 142. But I think the last piece that is important is in the decision making is what is the basis on which the federal government can make this decision? And in some cases, pipelines, for example, the federal government can broadly say, it's our decision to make, we get to make a public interest determination. But the court draws that little fine line here that says, no, the project isn't your decision to make. Your decision is about the impacts. And that's pulling us back maybe to SIA 2012 to say, can we, as the federal government, decide, are these impacts on fish justified under the circumstances? Are these impacts on navigable waters? And then, to Martin's point, how far does the federal government want to push that? Do they want to go back to the court with a reasoned argument that transboundary pollution is federal jurisdiction and we could legislate in that area in the same way we legislate fisheries? They do, then maybe we get some new law out of this in the end.
Thanks. I have so many things I'd love to follow up on there, and maybe we'll come back to some of those things, like I'll tee them up and then come back later. But the public interest determination and the balancing of factors, and are we only able to consider adverse federal effects or positive benefits from the provincial perspective? So let's park that and maybe come back to it if we have time. I do want to get to the broader implications of the decision, because I think lots of people on the webinar are very interested in what this means down the road for other policies, particularly in respect of Canada's ability to meet its climate targets. So broadly at first, and then perhaps we can get a little more specific with certain policies, but what do you think the impact the decision will have on our ability to meet our national climate targets? Is Parliament more constrained than it was before the decision, or is it about the same, or do you think it's going to have implications on that specifically? And how about we start with Andrew and then we'll go to Martin?
I think probably Parliament now has realized that they don't have a climate change trump card at the Supreme Court. So I think that's probably the most important thing, is that, there was a ability to read the GGPPA decision and say, as long as we argue this in the context of climate change, we're going to get a benefit of the doubt. And I think what the government saw in this case was that there's a provincialist coalition on the court that can trump that environmentalist coalition on the court. And So I think probably the government in that respect is slightly more constrained, but I hesitate on the links people have made to say, for example, the clean electricity regs or the oil and gas cap, that this has materially changed the consideration of that. And for those who are not constitutional lawyers, I'm certainly not one, but for those, I play one on TV sometimes, the like Mike from Suits, but the test will be, is there a federal head of power that underpins that particular piece of legislation? And my suspicion, and Nathalie, obviously you've written extensively on this, is that these new regulations that are the next challenges, single-use plastics fits in there too, the test will be the criminal law power, not, federal jurisdiction over works and undertakings, et cetera. And so that's going to present a very different test, and one that probably offers a wider door than the federal government had on this impact assessment reference. So I think there's probably a mixed bag here.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think the way that I and a couple of my colleagues sort of talked about this, and we have a blog post that we posted on the University of Calgary faculty law blog. Directly, the IAA reference says very little about those other initiatives, right? It's very squarely focused on impact assessment. And I think it's worth pointing out that in its current incarnation and since SIA 2012, right? And I thought that was really helpful, Natalie, when you had those four, on average, this major project regime that we've had in place since 2012, it takes in about, around 15 to 20 projects on an annual basis, right? So I think I did the numbers at one point, and it was, in any given year, there were maybe 50 or 60 environmental assessments going through the federal system, bearing in mind that these are multi-year sort of like endeavors, whereas in the prior days and under that decision-making trigger, we had thousands that were happening, right? And so then when you think about that number, when you think about those number of projects, of course, you start to realize, I think, very quickly, and this goes back, I think, to Andrew's point about, maybe strategy a little bit, like the Impact Assessment Act is not a major player in Canada's sort of like goal and drive towards net zero. It's too narrowly scoped, generally speaking, focusing on these individual big projects. Even maybe when we were still assessing giant big oil sands mines, some of those probably came into that world. I think, we remember 800,000 cars or something like that in terms of emissions. But generally speaking, even in aggregate, 50 to 20 projects on an annual basis, that's really not going to move the needle the same way that, for instance, sectoral regulations for the clean electricity sector are, for instance, or for an oil and gas emissions cap, right? And so that's, I think, a really important point, to point out that this was never really a big part of the game. I think the one caveat I'll put on that is I think there was some important symbolic value in some of the ways that the federal government had used and exercised its powers under this act, I think. And we actually, and the Supreme Court actually zeroes in on them, right? So there was the letter from Minister Guilbeault to Suncor, which basically said, on the heels of approving the Baie du Nord offshore oil and gas project, which I think its average barrel emissions were 0.9 kilograms or something like that, that in that space, he wrote Suncor at the same time and said, I noticed that your project's going to be around 65 kilograms per barrel of CO2 equivalents, and I'm not really inclined to approve that, or I don't see how that's really consistent with all our plans for decarbonization. So for instance, it's hard to put into concrete terms the value of that kind of that letter, frankly, and the kind of effect that it would have had and has on the trajectory of industrial development basically in Canada. So putting that as, so that's like the direct, I think, answer. I think there is something to be said about the vibe, as much as I hate talking about vibes, and Andrew's laughing, for sure there is in the Chief Justice's, I think, decision, a reminder to Canada, as I think Andrew and Al, you both said, there is a constitution here, there is a division of powers, and you need to be mindful of it, that as much as important as these issues are, each level of government has a role to play, as set out in the Constitution. And so, for instance, and so then recognizing exactly that some of these other initiatives, clean electricity, oil and gas emissions cap, zero emissions vehicle mandate, phase out by 2035. So all of those are being proposed in the context of what we understand, this reference in 9127, so this federal jurisdiction over in the broadest sense, the criminal law power. And it has its own rules, which the court doesn't talk about in this case at all, except for to note, the court does take a moment to say, like, I'm going to talk about resources, jurisdiction over activities. I note that there's also these other sort of like, and we've referred to them in other times as conceptual powers, like POG, like the criminal law power that gives Parliament the ability to regulate, to protect the environment, for instance, right? So there's the famous Hydro-Quebec decision from 1997, where the Supreme Court said Canada's toxic substances regime was upheld on the basis of the criminal law power. So then I think that the relevance of the IA reference is that, again, to Andrew's point, if Canada felt that since 1997, we've seen a ton of regulation being promulgated under SEPA, and we have, in fact, listed CO2, for instance, as a toxic substance. We phased out coal. We started to regulate the GHGs of vehicles. We're talking now about clean electricity. There have been, let's say, arguments or suggestions, I think, from provincial attorneys general, and others, that maybe the criminal law power has been expanded a little bit beyond its limits, and I think the case that is referred to most often is the Syncrude litigation at the Federal Court of Appeal, which was about the renewable fuel regulations, and those regulations were upheld under the criminal law power, notwithstanding the fact that they had this very interesting market-based compliance mechanism, which essentially allowed proponents, the regulated community, to purchase credits to be brought into compliance. And so I think when I look at the IA reference, it's a bit of the vibe of it is to remind Canada that there are rules here around how you use these different heads of power when you're legislating and regulating in this context, and be mindful not to play fast and loose with them just because you have the moral high ground here.
And I can see that Andrew would like to add to that, so go ahead.
I just want to fit in, and you had it on your slide, but I want to reemphasize there's lessons here for the provincial AGs too, right? And in particular, that paragraph 142 to say, no, just because if you read, don't do that thing where you pick up the Constitution and read the word exclusive ability to legislate around one particular area and read it as sort of interjurisdictional immunity or strong enclave around that project if you're a provincial AG. So I think there is some warning there for the provinces too, even though it was a win for the provincialists, if you like, at the Supreme Court.
Great. So I've got a couple other questions, and then I can see there's a few questions coming through the audience. So I'll turn to those in a couple of minutes. And if you do have audience members, if you do have questions you'd like our experts to address, do feel free to pop them into the Q&A. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And on that, a couple other questions for you. So first of all, again, we're sort of slowly stepping back into the different repercussions. How might the business sector, particularly the energy sector, interpret this? You've alluded to this already a little bit. In terms of the potential regs coming up and whether they might be justified under the criminal law power. We know there are some uncertainties there, but at the same time, there have been some strong precedents, like in the Hydro-Quebec case. But, if we're looking at this from a business perspective, an industry perspective, what does this ultimately mean for them? Do they need to be paying attention to this, or is this sort of business as usual, subject to perhaps a few modest amendments to the legislation that might be underway? So maybe you start, whichever one of you wants to start with that. Go ahead.
I guess I'm quick on the button, so I'll go. I think the big storyline, when Premier Kenney initially challenged this legislation, it was talking about pipelines, the No More Pipelines Act. And probably the most important thing here is this has almost nothing to do with pipelines. And so if you were worried about, the federal government's capacity to disrupt the otherwise massive growth of the oil and gas industry that you imagine would happen, very little has changed on this front. No one's going to build an oil sands mine without Fisheries Act approval. No one's going to build a pipeline without a federal public interest determination. And so all of that is kind of status quo. I think for the rest of the development that might have fallen under this, now we have a whole bunch of uncertainty, right? Because if you're midway through the process, you say, well, now I'm midway through a process that's not necessarily valid, heading to a decision that is not within the powers of the level of government that's making it. I'm going to have some other rule. I know I'll have some other rule, but I don't know what that's going to be. And even for projects that have gone through the assessment, so I'll use the tech frontier mine that Premier Smith talks about a lot. That came through its environmental assessment. It had pending Federal Fisheries Act approval needed post-assessment. It's sitting there in limbo. Where does it fit in? I think there's more uncertainty probably today for these projects, given the tenor of this decision, than there was maybe beforehand, where at least you knew the rules of the game. You might not have liked them, but you knew what they were. So there's more uncertainty, but maybe a sweep back a little bit in some of the requirements that'll come from the feds.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say, I mean, I think in some respects, yeah, on the interprovincial works and undertakings, I think, actually in some respects the court has made it even clearer that the federal government can really do whatever it wants and consider whatever it wants when it's approving those or not. I think there are a couple things going on here. I do fall in the camp that says that actually addressing, so immediately in the context of the Impact Assessment Act, I think it can be fixed relatively quickly. I think when you look, and I thought it was great, classic pedagogy there, Professor Chalifour, with the check marks and the X. I mean, so what we're at here, we know that we have to focus the screening decision, make sure that it's that adverse effects on areas of federal jurisdiction are the most important factor, not the only, right? But the court said it has to be the primary factor. That's not hard to do. The assessment stage is fine. Designating projects is fine, having that kind of list. And then at the decision making, right, to clean that up, to make sure that the primary consideration is adverse effects on federal jurisdiction. And again, I have some involvement, on a sort of semi-regular basis, thinking about the Impact Assessment Act. And when the agency says, well, this is pretty much how we've always implemented this act anyways. And in fact, the Supreme Court mentions that at one point, right, in its decision. It says, well, Canada says it's always done it this way, but the act and the language of the act doesn't sort of match that tightness. Again, I don't think it's going to be very hard for the agency together and in consultation to sort of come up with a way to do that. More stepping out then more sort of broadly, and the same thing for adverse effects. I mean, yeah, the language around changes. Okay, so fine, changes is too broad. We have to focus on adverse effects. We know that adverse effects applies in the context of fisheries. It can apply in the context of migratory birds. It can apply in the context of Indigenous peoples and lands reserved for Indigenous peoples, right? And that's a whole other, actually, that whole discussion, unfortunately, is really unsatisfactory. And I think there's a lot of, there's some discussion to be had there around what these different heads of power, what they will sustain. And I'm going to suggest that it's still very broad jurisdiction to look at projects that have adverse effects on these areas of federal jurisdiction. One thing, I guess, one comment I want to make is, like, we tend to always beat up and focus on the federal government. One thing that I guess I can't help but think is, if I was in industry thinking about this stuff, you're really not well served by having provincial politicians who very clearly exaggerate and in fact just outright lie about the meaning of these decisions. Like when the Premier of Alberta got on her sort of the presser there and start to say essentially that all these projects, it's an open season in Alberta. I mean, what a disservice, I think, to the business community, because it really does create that much more uncertainty, frankly, about what is actually going on. So I don't know what the chess is going on there, if it's 3D or whatever above my pay grade, but it certainly is the case, I think, that an argument could be made from the business community, I think, in this country, to sort of say to politicians, like, it's time to grow up a little bit and take this a little bit more seriously. And again, to the point that the Supreme Court made, in a sense. And I think, as we read that paragraph, I'm sure there are a lot of us who sort of like thought, wow, that's not going to land very well. And within minutes, it became very clear that that rhetoric and hyperbole almost makes that sort of like challenge to the federal and provincial governments almost impossible to meet. And so, again, I think that's the big one, is that if people want certainty, and we do, I think, we've churned through 4 impact assessment regimes in Canada in 4 decades, while the US is still on the first one that they had. everybody needs to come to the table sort of in a mature and good faith way and try to come up with a regime that's going to work. I think it can work. I think BC has shown us that it clearly can work. Other jurisdictions have shown that it can work. So like, get together, figure it out.
Great. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Andrew, or just move on to another question.
Let's move on because we got a lot in the Q&A that we want to hit.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, so let's start with that then. There's some good questions here popping up. I'll start with one of them. I think you've answered this one, but I'll just give you a chance to add to it if you wish, about playing this out in the context of a hypothetical new project. So maybe just looking at it very practically. Let's say a project is, a pipeline that provides energy security to Canadians from coast to coast. Can we get that through the process in a reasonable period of time? So you did talk about interprovincial pipelines, but maybe if you want to add anything to that, feel free, either of you.
Yeah, so I'll take that. Oh, go.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, this decision changes nothing really. And if anything, it just really affirms that the federal government, whoever is the federal government at the time, gets to decide about these projects and can decide on essentially, whatever basis it wants, and then again, there's a little bit of this weird, and unfortunately there was some, I think, literature that supported this and some jurisprudence. It's sort of like this distinction between jurisdiction over a resource and jurisdiction over an activity, and privileging somehow jurisdiction over an activity, setting aside, and we made this point again in our commentary following decision, Indigenous peoples, for instance, Section 9124, are neither a resource nor an activity, and yet the Supreme Court didn't really see fit to sort of discuss how that is different and important. But going back to that distinction, they have made that distinction and pretty clearly seem to suggest that when we're talking about an activity, that jurisdiction is comprehensive, and we can consider everything under the sun, in a sense, for the federal government. So absolutely, to the question, for sure, the federal government can consider energy security if it wants, but it can also consider things like climate change. It can consider impacts on Indigenous peoples. It can consider all those things under the sun. There's really, but importantly, perhaps, and this is maybe something that we forget, but we certainly were reminded, I think, about a decade or so ago, just because the federal government can consider all those things, the flip side is that it doesn't have to. And so a future government may choose not to, for instance, care about climate change, just like a current government might put less weight on questions about, for instance, energy security. And so ultimately, those are political determinations for which the executive will be accountable.
Yeah, I think the H2 pipeline is an interesting one because, of course, it does fall under the federal Canada Energy Regulator Act. It wouldn't fall directly anyway under the Impact Assessment Act, but there is some crossover. But for the most part, that would be a project that would be evaluated under the two regimes, but the overriding federal authority is that they could construct that pipeline. And as we've seen with, for example, the Trans Mountain pipeline, that is a case where the courts have upheld interjurisdictional immunity, where they've said, for example, that no, Burnaby, your valid tree cutting bylaws just simply are not applicable in the case of the Trans Mountain pipeline. And they've also said in the case of BC Environmental Management Act that no, BC, you can't legislate in relation to effects in the province if that legislation is in service of disrupting a pipeline. So I think, here there's one caveat that I'll put to this, but the project, the hypothetical that you put forward, is one that the federal government would be they would very plausibly be able to make this pipeline go, with the exception of the duty to consult under Section 35. And so the degree to which the federal government can sort of force infrastructure through is probably limited almost only by the judicial interpretation of that provision. Otherwise, it goes to a political question. And we've done the thing that I think legal scholars do is forget that the big actor here on a lot of this is the voters, right? It isn't just what does the government decide, it's what do the voters decide? And there are a lot of these questions that are just not questions for the courts. So as Martin said, if the next government or the current government decides it wants to have a radically different impact assessment regime or a radically different application of other federal laws to either slow down or enable development, that's a question for the voters. And that was one of the questions that voters had in their minds in 2015, after we'd seen a decade of consternation over pipelines. The Liberal government, or the Liberal platform, this was one of their commitments, was to fix this regime. And so, that's a political question, not a legal one, in terms of something like, a pipeline for hydrogen or a pipeline for oil, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. The question was about the hydrogen pipeline. Just moving into, and of course, we're all guilty of this, interested in law, but moving a little more into the political landscape, I think your answers there segue into a question that perhaps, Transitional Accelerator and its audience is interested in, which is, if this decision shifts the political landscape and perhaps the strategies of some of the major parties on, Canada's path to net zero. You've already alluded to that, but if you'd like to say anything more about that, I think it's worthwhile continuing that discussion a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know what the political strategy is around these issues this week. It's been a little bit of an interesting last 10 days. But I think you do have that political question that is going to confront, the Liberals on the one hand, the Conservatives on the other, which is, we have had difficulty attracting the types of major foreign direct investment into resource projects. We have a productivity gap, crisis, whatever the case may be in this country. And so there are some calls certainly or some suggestions that a more liberal assessment regime might open the doors to some of that. On the other hand, you have, a very conservative government in Alberta that is essentially laid down in traffic to stop renewables from entering the province at the borders, right? We're just like, keep these things out of here. And I think you see some trade-offs here where, for oil and gas, the Conservatives might say, like, go full speed ahead. It's not clear to me that they're going to have that same response about electricity transmission lines to enable renewable development or offshore wind or these sorts of projects. And so I think there is going to be, almost, for this project, I have this rule, for this project, I have this other rule. And we'll see if that, sort of gets shaken out on both sides as the discussion goes on about whatever the amendments to this legislation are going to be.
Yeah, and I think about just, so the dynamics of federalism are so interesting, and so people might remember, for instance, that, towards the end of the prior Conservative federal government's tenure, of course, GHG policy and laws and regulations were popping up all over, actually, right? And so, in fact, British Columbia has long had fairly sound policy around carbon taxing, and then Alberta, with Andrew's assistance there, sort of led the charge on a really ambitious, I think, climate plan. Ontario had a really ambitious climate plan. Quebec did, and so it was interesting to see, and the federal Liberals really got to benefit, I think, from that for at least a year, right? And we had that kind of pan-Canadian sort of consensus. But then, of course, and then all of a sudden the resistance, or whatever we want to call it, but we had sort of changes in provincial governments towards more conservative governments, and they were much less inclined to go along with those plans. And so then the federal Liberals really ended up having to carry a lot more of the ball, a lot more of that effort. And it's very possible that things will swing back the other way if in fact, for instance, if everyone's trying to read the tea leaves, what is the fate of the current federal government, and will we have a conservative government, for instance, going forward? What I think is interesting is that we will then see again the pendulum sort of swing back towards the importance of provincial governments in driving that policy, because I think it's we don't know currently what the federal Conservatives are thinking about. They haven't really been clear about that. In the past, their plans have always been, let's say, they've been hesitant, I think, to do anything really ambitious in the climate space. And so, but then we see yesterday, I couldn't help, I was watching the Premier's press conference, but we had, the British Columbia's, NDP government, a new NDP government in Manitoba, which seems to have embraced the challenge of climate change. And so, these dynamics are always changing. They're always changing, ebbing and flowing. And so to my mind, I guess for the audience, for those who are interested in and really want to help Canada move towards that kind of like transition towards a net zero economy and a low carbon economy, what it says to me is that you had a bit of an economy of effort because you were able to sort of really focus on a federal government, and you were getting sort of national results as a result of that. I think it probably is the case that they want to dust off their provincial sort of Rolodex, or whatever you might want to call it, and to understand that the provinces are still significant players and will be significant players in this space, and that they also have to be sort of brought on board. So you can't really, we have this tendency, I think, especially when we have a federal government that shows some kind of inclination towards environmental policy, to then just sort of like put all of the weight on that. And I think that is, frankly understandable, but maybe a little bit counterproductive in the long term, and that you have to keep an eye on the provincial game to avoid it, because again, as we see, in Alberta right now, it's very hard to do anything when your province has imposed a moratorium, for instance, on renewable energy projects.
Great, thank you. Those are such great answers, and I have to just use my moderator's prerogative just to mention that this decision, and many of the division of powers decisions that we've seen from the Supreme Court over the last 40, 50 years, emphasize that, enabling aspect, the fact that both governments, both levels of governments have a role to play. And I think it's really important to keep our eye on this, that these should be, obviously staying in our lanes to some extent, but that there's a really enabling theme to most of these decisions, even the ones that have, perhaps offered a bit of a slap on the wrist to, in this case, Parliament going a little too far. But coming back then to some of the details, we've kind of come high level, and I'd like to come back to some of the questions which have some specifics in them. One of them is with respect to, again, looking at the sort of flow of federal policies related to net zero. One of the questions has to do with regulating things like GHGs in building heat. That's obviously a complex interjurisdictional area, but the question is, could you comment on what this decision might mean? Does it change the landscape there, or what are your thoughts on that? I'm figuring Martin's going to go first here.
Yeah, I mean, so, this I think ties into sort of what we discussed a little bit on that second question. If we can think of a building, a building is a fact situation, right? And so the Supreme Court has laid out very clearly that in this space, federal and provincial government may, through their respective legislative jurisdiction, or Section 91 and 92, they may legislate in relation to that. So the question just becomes, again, then which head of power are you relying on? And then, in a sense, each head of power has its own rules, is how it goes down. And so the question becomes, are you following the rules for that head of power, right? And so we know that the court has said basically, like, for instance, when the head of power is a resource, you really kind of have to restrict yourself to the environmental effects on that resource. When you're dealing with an activity, you have broad jurisdiction, frankly, to do whatever you want. And so when we think about something like building codes, I think it's pretty clear that neither of those powers, there's not really a hook there for the federal government. But for instance, we may see, for instance, if we say that again, and so I think we should finally have this out so that at least the people who are participating today. So right, with the criminal law power, there are basically these three requirements, right? This idea that a valid criminal law purpose, and then followed by a form, what we call the purpose requirement, and then what we call the form requirement, a prohibition followed back by a penalty. And so I don't think there's any question. It's pretty easy, and this is what we saw in the Syncrude litigation. Suppressing climate change, battling climate change, reducing greenhouse gases is an evil, in the language of the jurisprudence, that Parliament may validly suppress using its criminal law power. I think that's not a problem. That falls right in line with the sort of the jurisprudence and the precedents around using the criminal law power for the purpose of environmental protection. Where things get sort of interesting is the form requirement, right? And so we know, though, even before environmental law was a thing, or certainly before Hydro-Quebec, we know that the courts have taken certainly not a strict and narrow approach to this problem, right? So for instance, we regulate tobacco advertising nationally using the criminal law power, right? Toxic substances, genetic information most recently. So we know that this power can be used in different contexts, and we know that the courts have not been very strict, at least not overly strict on this requirement. And so I think that, so when we're talking about buildings, that's the analysis. Can we do this? And so, and on this point, I guess, and I'll pass it on, but So we have this very interesting dynamic in Canada where industry demands flexibility on so many of these things. They want maximum flexibility, but then they use that flexibility as essentially a legal argument in court to say that the federal government has surpassed its jurisdiction. It was so interesting, when you think about the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act reference, that was the federal government bending over backwards to kind of come up with the most flexible mechanism, the most efficient economically mechanism to allow industry and the provinces to decrease their emissions. And in a sense, the provinces took that and said, we're going to sue you for being flexible, for trying to regulate this thing. You don't have plenary power. And the point that Stuart Elgie has made recently, I think that the provinces admitted in that context that the feds could use the criminal law power, for instance, in this context, but that it didn't have this plenary jurisdiction to regulate in such a sort of detailed way. And so this is the kind of the dilemma that we have, right? Is that on the one hand, we want to provide that flexibility because we want climate action and mitigation to be as efficient as possible. But the minute we provide too much, what might appear like flexibility, then what I will call, for simplicity, just like bad faith actors will pounce on that flexibility to argue that the federal government has exceeded its jurisdiction. So in some respects, I sometimes want to say to the federal government, so forget it, like go narrow, go rigid, make it hurt, and then see if and essentially motivate the provinces to come up with more efficient and more flexible regimes under the regulatory sort of power. And let's have that conversation then, because at this point it really is really difficult. You have, going back for a second to the oil sands. I mean, they insist on flexibility, but then but then they say, but then Parliament, you don't have the jurisdiction to do it under criminal law because you want to engage in these market-based mechanisms. So that's the real problem, is that we have these sort of competing, or this tension, I guess, between the flexibility that we want and then the rules with some uncertainty in terms of how far we can go from a jurisdictional perspective.
Do you want me to add to that, or you want to jump to? We've got a bunch of questions, so Nathalie, your prerogative here.
Feel free to add if you'd like to, and if not, we'll jump to the questions.
So I agree with Martin on the 3 Ps, and I actually have for a long time had my little hobby horse to say, like a lot of the other plenary federal powers, tax power, trade and commerce, peace, order, good government, etc., that the criminal law power is the one that stands out as probably not having these collars on its use and its invasion into provincial jurisdiction. And so I've long felt that something is going to have to give that changes that a little bit. But it's an easier argument to make in some cases around the environment than it is on a general basis. So I'm still working on that. We'll see if we get there. But, I do think that it's easy to think about, I want the federal government to be able to do this thing that I want them to be able to do. But I think we also have to put ourselves in a position of saying, do we want a federal government that disagrees with us to have these similar powers? So do I want a hypothetical government to be able to outlaw wind and solar over the objections of a progressive province? Maybe I don't. And so, those I think make it more challenging than, can I find a way to squeeze federal regulation that I like into a criminal law power? When it comes to questions of building codes, I go back to subsidiarity, right? Think of what this looks like. You have city level buildings inspectors enforcing provincial building codes. You have builders in particular regions. The federal government's just going to be at that narrow level really, really bad at it. And we see that even in the heat pumps discussion, where a great study that the Canadian Climate Institute put out a little bit ago that says, look, these are very different in different regions of the country. And this is part of why we like provincial and municipal regulation. If you had a federal legislation that said thou shalt have a heat pump, then there's a lot of us that are really cold on the prairies for some of the time. Thou shalt not have natural gas heat in your home. Okay, that works reasonably well in some parts of the country, not in others. And so it is really like there's a reason why we have some of these provincial powers too. It's not just that, we let the provinces do some things and then the federal government can take over when, they need a sort of supervisory impact. I did want to make another little side point, though, and this is to maybe it's probably Jean Leclerc's point initially, but I think you talk about cooperative federalism, but I think we have another world that's coming towards us now that we really need to think about is, it's not a question just of division of powers, but it's a question, Jean Leclerc uses the term intransigence. And I think, we saw this in GGPPA. Is it provincial inability or is it provincial unwillingness? We're seeing it with clean electricity. We're seeing it with other things. And so I think that's going to be where, the courts can say cooperative federalism all they want, but actually what they're being asked to adjudicate is exactly the opposite. And I don't know, Nathalie, I'd probably punt that one back to you, but I think it's going to be an interesting challenge for the courts to say to what degree can different levels of government effectively, do the opposite of cooperate.
Oh, well, and then I've got lots to say on that, but it's not for this webinar because it ties in very much to the other constitutional law angle of rights, which of course there's lots of case law on that too, and lots of developments that are very interesting. So perhaps we can tee that up for a future discussion. We've got about 10 or just under 10 minutes left, or 7 minutes left, I think. So we'll just quickly rapid fire a few of the questions remaining. So one of them is, can you comment on the Supreme Court's majority's comments on how a party's right to judicial review of a decision is not a substitute for validity? So that just speaks to this issue of the actual project versus the reference opinion. So again, rapid fire, one or both of you, if you could just give a couple comments on that. So.
Yeah, I think we saw that in GGPPA too, in the dissent saying, this is legislation that could be used in very unconstitutional ways. And the majority there says, well, come see us when it does. And here the majority says, the fact that you could judicially review these individual decisions doesn't save the legislation itself. In this case, it's too broad. Doesn't matter that I can, judicially review individual decisions. It's the fact that the overall legislation is too broad that triggers the invalidity finding, and the judicial review doesn't save it. So two sides of the same coin, I think.
You want to add to that, Martin, or is that? Yeah. And there's some really interesting questions there too. Again, I encourage people to read the dissent just to get the other perspective, because there's a bit of a tension there with, there's a lot of jurisprudence in the past that has been very much supportive of very broad wording in environmental legislation because of how tricky environmental legislation can be, and it needs to be worded generally, but here we have a bit of a pullback on that. So interesting to see that dynamic. Okay, another question here was with respect to timing. People are interested in understanding what we can think about in terms of the timing of these amendments. And perhaps if you're inclined to guess or hazard a guess at what the amendments might look like, whether they're going to be major or minor, but if you could speak particularly to the timing. Not sure which one of you would like to take that on.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in a normal course, right, if this had been an actual fact-based litigation where there was a proponent challenging the decision and the court decided that the law was unconstitutional, right? I mean, I think in other contexts, we see the courts giving the federal government anywhere from 6 months to a year, frankly, to sort of get its house in order, right? So they will suspend their declaration essentially of unconstitutionality to give the government. And we saw that in the context of, I think, MAID and some of those other sort of like charter-based sort of litigations. So I think similarly here, like, I think, we got the decision in October. The federal government has sort of already indicated that it doesn't see this as a wholesale sort of like rejigging, but rather, I think the language is targeted amendments. I think they have committed to talking with the provinces. They're going to talk with industry. They have also talked about sort of rolling this into an initiative that was already actually taking off right before the decision came out, which was this general preoccupation with streamlining, right? And this idea that, the idea that behind this act, that it was about better environmental decision making, but it was also about making sure that good projects get built. And then, of course, I think the focus, and I see this in some of the questions being reflected here, is around critical minerals, right? The idea around mining and making sure that we're bringing online that capacity to meet the sort of electrification challenges that we're going to have in the next decade. So, so that tells me that, yeah, 6 months sounds about right. And we'll see. Obviously, then we have to sort of jive and square that with the parliamentary schedule. We are in a technically it doesn't feel like it some days, but we are about midway through the current minority Liberal government's mandate. If they hang on by their teeth for the next couple of years, then yeah, I mean, I think we would expect amendments. Yeah, not before, I don't think, next spring. And then, of course, they would have to make their way through the House. But I do think that, again, they've made it pretty clear that so far as they're concerned, they see this as being fairly targeted amendments, not a wholesale rejection. But I do think that they will take this opportunity to also try to address concerns that they've heard from industry that the act is still not as efficient as would be hoped. And so we'll have to see how that plays out.
You did a brilliant job of answering multiple questions at once there, Martin. So Andrew, over to you, if you wanted to add to that.
No, I'll pass on that one. I think we're
all right. Well, we are coming towards the end of the time. There's really only 2 minutes left. So I know the two of you have access to the questions as well. So maybe I'll give you each a minute to offer a last comment, either general comment, or if you'd like to target one of the questions that's been asked. I think we've covered quite a few of them. One of them that we didn't cover was on strategic environmental assessment. Not sure if that's doable in a minute, but I'll turn it over to you, Andrew, for your last word. And then Martin, you'll get a chance as well.
Sure. I think there was an interesting comment that is really in your wheelhouse, Nathalie, but I'll take it on the question of the national concern and greenhouse gas emissions. And that's one of those things where the legal term national concern has a slightly different meaning than the sort of colloquial use of the term. But I do think that the overriding question that comes from this reference is, and Martin and I have had this argument over and over again, if we think that the federal government has sort of this jurisdiction over transboundary pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, at some point, somebody's going to have to make that argument and say, we can do a Greenhouse Gas Emissions Act the same way we can do a Fisheries Act. And might win, might lose. But I think that is sort of the question that we are dancing around in this legislation. It's a little bit in the oil and gas cap. It's a little bit in the clean electricity regs. And, maybe we never get there, as is sometimes the case with these division of powers fights. But that's the underlying crux of the argument is, do we think that greenhouse gases are essentially an area where the federal government has a really broad aspect that they can legislate through, or a really narrow one? And so far, the courts have said, yeah, you can do greenhouse gas emissions pricing if you do it in a really unintrusive way, as Martin said. I think the question will be, how much broader is that federal aspect on greenhouse gases? Kind of like securities. How big is the federal lens?
Great point to end on, Martin.
Yeah, and I'll just riff off of that to say, so that, because I think some people might be sort of pulling their hair out and thinking to themselves, well, of course the federal government has jurisdiction over transboundary issues. And in a sense, that argument was made to the court. It's legally impossible for a province like Alberta, for instance, to authorize impacts in Saskatchewan or in the Northwest Territories. And so the problem is, the homework that I'm assigning to everybody, especially the lawyers, I guess, who are paying attention, who want to see a federal role here, is to devise a jurisdiction over transboundary impacts that at the same time, we can call it de minimis, or we could, the concern is that by regulating transboundary impacts, you then get right up inside the province's jurisdiction. So how do you craft a jurisdiction over transboundary impacts that is deft and sort of nimble enough that it can deal with those without at the same time usurping essentially all provincial jurisdiction over the sort of intra-provincial aspects of those projects? And so that's really the challenge I think that we have going forward as lawyers and academics who want to see a strong federal role here, because it just seems so obvious and intuitive, is to provide the sort of the jurisdictional framework for being able to do that so that it preserves that provincial jurisdiction.
Excellent. And as many of you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that issue as well. It's near and dear to my heart, and I will continue to think about it because I think that is the quintessential question. And I think we all know that our constitutional division of powers was not crafted in a way that makes that resolution easy, but that the imperative we face with the transition to net zero and our climate objectives are making us face that question in a very, very real way. So we didn't address a number of issues, including some of the important questions with respect to Indigenous peoples and jurisdiction, and there was lots more to say, but I think we covered a lot of territory. So I do want to thank everybody, particularly Andrew and Martin and the Transition Accelerator, for organizing this webinar. Everybody in the audience who posed questions, they were great questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I think we covered a fair bit. And I hope many of you will have been left with lots of food for thought, and perhaps I'll pass it over to Bruce for a final word. Thank you.
Yeah, just a big thanks to everyone. A great session. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Nathalie, for doing a wonderful job of moderating us today. And have a safe rest of your day.